For listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Evelyn, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 18th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Sea changers. The world's oceans are becoming dangerously acidic. A controversial proposal would raise the pH by mixing chemicals into the water. By Faris Jabbar. A few months ago, the oceanographer Sam Subhas and his colleagues turned the sea red. At first it looked as if the scientists had dumped a few barrels of beet juice into the Gulf of Maine. A narrow band of crimson water lingered in the wake of one of their chartered vessels, briefly tinging violet here or magenta there when tumbled by wind and waves. As the ship began to make a circle, the maroon trail elongated and expanded, soon filling a much larger part of the sea. Onlookers on a passing vessel might have mistaken the scene for the aftermath of a shark attack. It was, in fact, something even more unusual, and to some people no less alarming. The scientists were deliberately pumping about 16,200 gallons of sodium hydroxide, more commonly known as lye, into the ocean, along with a red dye that made the solution easier to track. It was the final phase of a study on a promising yet controversial climate intervention, one that could simultaneously mitigate both global warming and another equally terrifying consequence of carbon emissions, the rapid acidification of the world's oceans. Since the advent of the industrial age, the oceans have absorbed about 1/3 of humanity's heat-trapping carbon emissions. Were it not for that immense buffer, the planet would be substantially warmer and more tempestuous than it is today. As carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolves into the ocean, however, it reacts with seawater to form carbonic acid, which disrupts the ocean's chemical balance and reduces its capacity to absorb more carbon. Prolonged acidification will severely threaten marine ecosystems and fisheries on which more than 1 billion people depend. To counteract these effects, scientists have proposed a type of geoengineering known as ocean alkalinity enhancement, which essentially involves concocting antacids for the sea. Modifying the planet's chemistry in this way allows more carbon to flow from the atmosphere to the ocean, where it can be stored for thousands of years. Experts emphasize that such mediation would be entirely ineffectual without first slashing greenhouse gas emissions. Yet they also agree that emissions reductions alone are no longer sufficient to prevent the planet from warming 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline, at which point extreme weather, sea ice decline, species loss, and crop failures would be anywhere from 2 to 10 times as bad as they are now, and at which tens of millions more people would be subjected to severe heat, flooding, and water scarcity. Given that the oceans cover more than 70% of the planet's surface and are fundamental to climate regulation, it seems inevitable that they will be part of these supplemental efforts. In mid-August, Subhas, who works for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and his colleagues convened several ships in a region of the Atlantic known as Wilkinson Basin, about 50 miles off the coast of Massachusetts. The main research vessel followed closely behind the dispersal ship, continually sampling and analyzing seawater. An entourage of autonomous underwater robots helped collect further data. At its largest, the red patch of alkalinity measured about 6 miles across in some parts. It raised the water's pH from a baseline of 7.95 to 8.3. After 5 days of close observation, when the pH had returned to its pre-experiment level and the dye had faded, Subhas, pronounced Subhash, and his colleagues began the journey back to Woods Hole, where they have since been analyzing their findings. What we can say so far is that we set up exactly the right conditions for the surface ocean to take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, Subhash told me. There's no question that there was a flux. The big question now is, can we quantify it? Developing reliable metrics is just one of the many hurdles to global carbon removal. Limiting warming to under 2 degrees Celsius requires the capture and sequestration of perhaps 7 to 9 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year, in addition to steep reductions in emissions. Experts estimate that ocean alkalinity enhancement alone could remove somewhere between 1 and 15 billion tons. But the investment and infrastructure needed to reach even a fraction of that potential is immense. The supplemental mining effort required to remove just 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually by adding alkaline minerals to the sea would most likely be equivalent to a second global cement industry, for example. If we're serious about carbon dioxide removal, it's going to be the largest thing humanity has ever done, says David Ho, a professor of oceanography at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and an expert in the marine carbon cycle. It really should be something that governments pour effort into, like the Manhattan Project. Planetary scale carbon removal may prove both necessary and feasible, but that does not negate its fundamental audacity or absurdity. Several centuries ago, humanity began to pilfer an immense power from the planet, hundreds of millions of years of sunlight channeled through the pulsing greenery of life, swallowed by the earth, and compacted into outrageously energy-dense reservoirs of carbon we call fossil fuels. By setting those ancient repositories on fire, industrial nations initiated an eruption of carbon into the atmosphere at a rate that has no parallel in at least the past 66 million years. The consequences, more obvious by the day, have already been disastrous. Yet obstinate governments continue to feed the blaze, ignoring the available solutions. Forced to reckon with these compounding failures, but unwilling to forfeit the possibility of a better future, the world turns now to another ancient earthly power. We look once more to the ocean. I don't think it's realistic to leave the oceans untouched, says David Kowick, the chief scientist at Ocean Visions, a nonprofit conservation organization that focuses on marine approaches to countering climate change. Our collective inaction has left us with little choice. As a graduate student in geochemistry at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, Subhash became fascinated by Earth's long-term carbon cycle, which regulates climate and balances the pH of the ocean. Carbon continually cycles between air, sea, and land. Throughout Earth's history, huge injections of carbon into the atmosphere from, say, increased volcanic activity have resulted in a sweltering climate, a more acidic ocean, and in some cases, mass extinction of marine life. As seawater becomes more acidic, it interferes with the physiology of ocean creatures in numerous ways, disrupting processes as diverse as metabolism, sensory perception, reproduction, and communication. Extreme acidification is especially disastrous for a group of organisms known as calcifiers, which include corals, mollusks, crustaceans, and many types of plankton. Calcifiers construct their shells and skeletons from alkaline minerals present in seawater, in particular calcium and carbonate. As pH drops, carbonate becomes more or less available, and calcifiers struggle to build and maintain their armor. If the ocean becomes too acidic, they begin to dissolve. Between the Industrial Revolution and 2024, the average pH of surface seawater decreased from about 8.2 to 8.04, corresponding to a 40% increase in acidity. The current rate of ocean acidification is greater than it was during any ecological crisis in at least the past 300 million years, so anomalous that it's difficult to precisely predict how it will warp the modern ocean. Given that plankton from the foundation of ocean food webs, however, and that coral reefs alone support 25% of marine species, the implications are dire. Highly important fisheries ranging from oysters, crabs, and lobsters to herring, salmon, and cod could dwindle or collapse. Earth as a whole is not helpless in the face of climate and chemical volatility, however. It has powerful self-stabilizing processes. When carbon floods the atmosphere, making the planet hotter and stormier, its carbon sequestering processes speed up. First, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere combines with rainwater, making it slightly acidic. As rain falls on land, it breaks down rocks, including ones like basalt and limestone, which contain alkaline minerals. Rivers carry the minerals liberated from these rocks to the ocean, where they nourish calcifiers and bind to dissolved carbon in seawater, reducing its acidity and allowing it to absorb more carbon from the atmosphere. In tandem, the remains of dead calcifiers sink into the depths, sequestering carbon in thick layers of seafloor sediments. Over hundreds of thousands to millions of years, these processes gradually pull carbon from the atmosphere, raise the pH of the ocean, and cool the planet. Although this innate resilience helps keep Earth stable on geologic timescales, it operates far too slowly to save extant life from the current rates of warming and acidification. Ocean alkalinity enhancement is an attempt to emulate and accelerate the planet's stabilizing feedback loops so that they occur in a matter of decades. In 1995, Harun Kezgi, a chemical engineer at Exxon, published one of the first formal proposals for such an intervention, focusing on the feasibility of adding huge quantities of lime to the sea. Since then, scientists have published numerous simulations, and modeling studies on many different alkaline treatments. But field studies in the ocean itself were hampered by a prevailing taboo against geoengineering. Now, an increasingly open-minded attitude towards geoengineering within the scientific community, combined with recent waves of funding, is allowing researchers to break out of the lab and study the effects of alkalinity-based interventions in the real world. The Gulf of Maine experiment, part of a project named Loch Ness, locking ocean carbon in the northeast shelf and slope, reflects this shift. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 18th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In parallel, Numerous startups are already capitalizing on surging interest in alkalinity enhancement. Vesta, based in San Francisco, has focused on augmenting existing beach nourishment projects, spreading close to 9,000 tons of sand made of the mineral olivine in nearshore waters around New York and North Carolina. Ebb Carbon, also headquartered in the Bay Area, has installed equipment at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Sequim, Washington, that electrochemically separates seawater into acidic and alkaline streams and returns the alkaline stream to the ocean. Planetary Technologies, based in Nova Scotia, diffuses magnesium hydroxide through existing coastal outfalls at a power plant in Halifax. Last June, it became the first of these companies to deliver verified carbon removal credits to its high-profile customers, which include British Airways, Stripe, and Shopify. While entrepreneurs in the private sector often justify this rapid development as a necessary response to a global emergency, many scientists and environmentalists argue that deployment must wait for the answers to a couple of key questions, namely, is ocean alkalinity enhancement actually effective, and is it safe? Concentrated sodium hydroxide is a highly caustic substance with a pH of 14, or what Subhash calls pure alkalinity. It's used in detergents, drain cleaners, and paper manufacturing. It's also used to treat drinking water, produce anticoagulants, and give traditional soft pretzels their glossy brown crust. Accidental spills of sodium hydroxide in rivers and creeks have killed thousands of fish, although spills in the ocean have also harmed wildlife in the immediate vicinity. There is no evidence of long-lasting environmental repercussions, most likely owing to the alkalinity's dilution in a vast body of water. Subhash and his collaborators designed their research apparatus to rapidly disperse lye in seawater, minimizing the risk of burning or killing nearby organisms. They calculated that their study might kill only 9 more fish than would have died otherwise from natural causes. Every expert I interviewed agreed that the Woods Hole experiment did not present a significant danger to wildlife or the ocean ecosystem. Orchestrating similar interventions on a global scale would be a much more complicated and risky endeavor. All viable forms of alkalinity require substantial energy and infrastructure to obtain and deliver, which entail their own emissions and environmental ramifications. Limestone, basalt, and olivine must be mined, pulverized, and in some cases chemically transformed before being transported to the coast. Potent alkaline solutions are produced through industrial processes and must be carefully handled. Electrochemical methods depend on dedicated, continuously operating facilities. Adding too much alkalinity too quickly risks supersaturating seawater, which can result in spontaneous runaway accumulation of solid minerals, a process that releases carbon dioxide and lowers pH, greatly reducing or potentially negating the primary benefits of the enterprise. And even if alkaline materials are successful mixed into the ocean, measuring and verifying the subsequent carbon removal is quite challenging. When the pH of the ocean increases, carbon gradually flows from air to sea over a period of weeks to years. In that time, as the introduced alkalinity diffuses across a large region of the ocean, the shift in carbon it's presumably causing becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish from background fluctuations. A prominent concern among the public and scientists alike is how planetary scale alkalinity enhancement would affect life in the ocean. Research to date has largely concluded that moderate levels of alkalinity enhancement would have negligible or beneficial effects on many, though certainly not all, forms of ocean life. A recent review of 68 studies covering 84 species, including plankton, corals, mollusks, and crustaceans, found that close to 40% of biological responses to increased alkalinity were neutral, 34% were positive, and 26% were negative. But many questions remain understudied. The rocks that might be mined for such interventions, for example, sometimes contain certain nutrients and heavy metals that encourage algal blooms or have toxic effects like bioaccumulate. High concentrations of alkaline substances can also limit the availability of carbon dioxide and increase the murkiness of seawater, hindering the ability of phytoplankton to perform photosynthesis. What I am most concerned about are long-term, multi-generational effects on food webs and ecosystem structure and function that we cannot easily predict, says Nina Bednarek, a senior scientist at the Joseph Stefan Institute in Slovenia and a co-author of the recent review on how marine life responds to shifts in ocean chemistry. Those sorts of changes can only be observed as alkalinity accumulates over long periods of time. Experts agree that beyond capturing carbon, a continuous planet-wide implementation of ocean alkalinity enhancement would raise the average pH of the ocean's surface, but only marginally, perhaps by 0.5% or less. At this point, it's simply not feasible for humans to return the ocean to its pre-industrial chemical baseline because the cost, effort, and material resources required are too gargantuan. A global effort would, however, help prevent further acidification, as a marine antacid alkalinity enhancement will probably be more effective in select regions of the coast that are home to especially vulnerable fisheries and ecosystems like coral reefs. Such defenses have a long history. The indigenous peoples of western North America farmed clams in walled gardens along the shore to which they routinely added crushed shells. Research has since confirmed that doing so raises the pH of the water, improving the growth and survival rates of juvenile shellfish, and in combination with other benefits of the gardens, yielding 2 to 4 times as many adults. In the mid-2000s, oyster hatcheries in the Pacific Northwest began experiencing mysterious mass mortalities. They initially suspected a pathogenic bacterium, but in collaboration with Oregon State University scientists, they discovered that ocean acidification was the true culprit. Along the west coast, strong upwelling frequently brings deeper, more acidic water to the surface. Some hatcheries now ameliorate the seawater they pump into their onshore facilities with sodium carbonate. We can't use the water as it is anymore, says Sue Cudd, the owner of Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery in Netarts, Oregon. We have to buffer. I don't think we can realistically talk about mitigating acidification on a global scale. Bednarek says, you need to identify the most sensitive regions and fisheries, the ones you really want to preserve, and tackle those first, not just for the sake of the marine ecosystem, but also for the human connections. The nascent field of ocean-based climate interventions is currently straddling a rift between scientific consensus and public perception. Many experts are finding that even if they secure the support of their colleagues and the necessary legal permissions, fostering trust and understanding among the public remains a challenge. In recent years, miscommunication and secrecy on the part of scientists and startups have resulted in a string of failed geoengineering efforts and bad publicity. In early 2023, environmentalists in Cornwall, England, were outraged to learn that Planetary Technologies had already conducted an enhanced alkalinity trial in the area the previous fall, adding a milky slurry of magnesium hydroxide to an existing stream of treated wastewater flowing into St. Ives Bay. Intense protests, debates, and scrutiny followed, continuing even after an independent report commissioned by the United Kingdom's Environment Agency concluded that such trials pose very little risk to marine life. Last spring, Planetary Technologies officially canceled plans for further projects in the region, citing commercial infeasibility. The Woods Hole team was determined to avoid similar mistakes. Over the course of a year, Subhash and his colleagues conducted more than 50 meetings and workshops with fishermen, tribal communities, policymakers, and local businesses. They explained that their experiment was small, controlled, and safe, that it was independent of commercial enterprises, and that the intervention they were investigating was intended to protect marine life and the livelihoods it sustains. Nevertheless, the study generated considerable controversy. Fishermen repeatedly raised concerns about disrupted operations and potential harm to crustaceans, fish, and North Atlantic right whales. This will be completely devastating in any and all wildlife in the area. Ryan Sirois, a commercial lobsterman, posted on the Environmental Protection Agency's website during a window for public feedback. I hope you stop this outrageous pollution of our oceans as soon as possible. Our planet depends on it. Some of the early in-person meetings were tense, says Sarah Schumann, a commercial fisherman who advocates fishery-friendly climate action. Adam said 2 sentences, and the fishermen started blasting him with questions, she recalls. We've had so many experiences over the centuries where putting a chemical in water or air has come back to bite us, so it's really hard now to be told that adding this chemical could reverse some of the damage. Much of the New England fishing community remains uneasy to this day. Several fishermen I interviewed said that they were not even aware of the initial EPA review period until it was almost over, and that most of their colleagues had never heard of marine carbon dioxide removal. The window for public comment also coincided with an offshore wind turbine accident near Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, which exacerbated opposition to perceived tampering with the ocean more generally. Is that a 9? The tensions reflect long-standing factions of resistance in the United States to expert-backed proposals for managing climate change. The Trump administration has repeatedly interfered with renewable energy projects. Fossil fuel interests have funded disinformation campaigns that portray wind turbines as environmental menaces, and some environmentalists have tried to stop the development of solar farms that impinge on endangered species habitats. Because so many people view the ocean as life-sustaining and inviolable, Disagreements about marine-based climate interventions tend to be especially intense. Members of the same New England commercial fishing communities that objected to the Woods Hole experiment have denounced offshore wind projects. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 18th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The repeated failure of world powers to sufficiently curb greenhouse gas emissions has forced humanity into a bizarre pantomime. It feels like dancing around a wildfire with butterfly nets in hand, trying to catch every stray ember and flakes of ash while half-heartedly throwing teacups of water into the flames. Within the confines of this disorienting predicament, the necessary responses to climate change can appear to be, or can be made to look, as appalling as its repercussions. Opponents of offshore wind have parroted the claim that the noise and infrastructure associated with wind farms disrupt cetacean communication and navigation, forcing whales to beach and die. Wind turbines are causing whales to die in numbers never seen before, President Trump has said. Although researchers plan to investigate the long-term effects of offshore wind farms on cetaceans, there is no scientific evidence that they are currently killing whales. A majority of recorded injuries and deaths among Atlantic right whales, the species of greatest concern, are related to entanglements with fishing gear and collisions with vessels. The most pressing threat to whales, plankton, life on Earth, and civilization as we know it is not wind farms or preliminary studies on ocean alkalinity enhancements, but rather the very crisis both are intended to help resolve. Diagnosis by Lisa Saunders, MD. The man's intense chest pain wasn't a heart attack, but he was certain that something was very wrong. The 52-year-old man pushed back from his dinner plate. A terrible pressure radiated across his chest. His first bite of supper felt like an enormous rock scraping its way ever so slowly down to his stomach. It was hard to take a good breath. His face felt flushed and hot. Then gradually the grip around his chest seemed to loosen, and he could breathe again. He had this pain once a few months earlier. That time, the pressure was accompanied by a strange numbness and tingling down his left arm. He was terrified he was having a heart attack, and his wife rushed him to the local emergency room at Kaiser Permanente in Santa Rosa, California. A middle-aged man with crushing chest pain that radiates down the arm doesn't have to wait long to be seen. But an EKG, a chest x-ray, and a dozen blood tests later, the doctor in the ER reassured him that although they weren't sure where his pain was coming from, it wasn't his heart. The man wondered if it was his workouts. For most of his life he had been indifferent to the condition of his body. By middle age he had put on a lot of weight. His doctors and the Mirror told him he was obese, but it hadn't mattered to him. He thought of himself as a numbers guy, a banker, successful, happily married, with 3 children. But that indifference disappeared 5 years earlier. His bank was robbed, a gun pointed straight at his heart. After that, he knew he needed a change. He started eating better and going to the gym 3 or 4 times a week. In those 5 years, he lost a lot of fat and put on a good bit of muscle. He pushed himself to press and lift heavier weights, enjoying the sense of strength it gave him, and he liked the way his body looked, after decades of not really looking at it. But the price, he noted, was that he often had muscle pain throughout the body. He wondered if the chest pain could be from muscles that had not been worked too hard. He had noticed that recently his usual workouts seemed harder. Maybe he needed a break from the gym. Not working out didn't help. The pressure-like pain was there every day, and always worse when he ate. He called his primary care physician and described his symptoms. The doctor suggested that this could be heartburn, in which acid from the stomach irritates the tube connecting it to the mouth. That tube, the esophagus, is just behind the heart, and pain or irritation there can mimic the pain of a heart attack. The fact that the pain worsened when he ate supported the likelihood that this was a problem with his esophagus rather than his heart. The doctor told him to try an acid-suppressing medication like famotidine and follow up in a month or so. The patient took the medication. It didn't help. If anything, the chest pain and pressure with eating continued to worsen. He emailed his doctor, who suggested that he try a stronger medication, Prilosec. This drug could block the production of even more of the acid irritating his esophagus and allow it to heal. The patient took the new drug, but the pain persisted. He started to dread mealtimes. The first few bites were always painful and often triggered excruciating hiccups. He'd drink water and that would help, but every bite remained uncomfortable. Finally, when he had been on the medication for several weeks with no improvement, he called to make an appointment to see his doctor. He was out of town that week, so the patient saw the nurse practitioner instead. She thought he had a severe form of chronic heartburn called gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD. The persistent irritation of the delicate tissues of the esophagus can cause severe injury to the inner wall, a condition known as erosive esophagitis, and that can take weeks, sometimes months, to heal. She ordered some labs and encouraged him to continue taking the medication. The doctor reviewed the labs when he got back to town. The only abnormality was an elevated lipase, a digestive enzyme that helps break down triglycerides, a type of fat. It is secreted by the pancreas and is usually elevated when that organ is inflamed, although it can be seen in other disorders. Pancreatitis is excruciatingly painful, especially after eating. The pancreas is behind the lower part of the stomach, stretching across the abdomen, so it was conceivable that it was the cause of the man's discomfort. The source of abdominal pain is notoriously hard to identify. Maybe this was pancreatitis. The doctor ordered a CT scan of his patient's abdomen. In the scan, the man's pancreas looked totally normal. Indeed, everything looked totally normal. The doctor was reassured by this. This probably was just really bad heartburn. But the patient remained worried. He was certain that something was terribly wrong and he needed to know what. The man finally saw his internist in person the following month. By then, consuming solid foods had become so difficult that he had given up eating altogether and was getting his nutrients from protein shakes. He had lost a few pounds. A routine screening to look for blood in the stool found some. Only then did his doctor seem worried. He increased the medication to twice a day and referred him to a gastroenterologist to get a colonoscopy and, at the patient's insistence, an upper endoscopy. He also added a second medication, Carafate, which forms a protective covering over injured tissue, shielding it from any acid that remained. The 5 weeks the man had to wait to be scoped felt endless. Finally, on the morning of his scheduled appointment, his wife drove him to Kaiser Permanente Medical Center. He awoke in the recovery room, his wife at his side. The physician who had done the procedure explained what they had found, but the words just bounced off the patient's still foggy brain. It wasn't until the nurse gave him instructions that he heard the word cancer. It was the only word he heard. The drive home was silent. Once there, the man and his wife examined the paper they'd been given. There was a large mass invading the lower third of his esophagus, they read. That was the cause of his pain. And what made swallowing anything solid so difficult? And it was probably cancer. They would know for certain once they had the biopsy results. The patient had a PET scan a couple of weeks later to look for signs of cancer beyond his esophagus. Nothing more was found. He then met with an oncologist who shared the biopsy result. He had esophageal cancer. It was scary to hear his worst fears confirmed, but also a relief to finally know the cause of his pain. At least now they could address it. The oncologist laid out next steps. He would have chemotherapy, then surgery, then more chemotherapy. Esophageal cancer is rare in this country, and the mortality rate remains high. It is often an unusual but dangerous long-term complication of an extremely common problem, reflux. This patient had the occasional bout of heartburn, but nothing noteworthy, at least not until the months leading to his cancer diagnosis. At 52, the man was younger than the average patient with esophageal cancer, but studies have shown that its rate is rising in younger patients. Early diagnosis is essential, but even then, the 5-year survival rate of this cancer hovers around 50%. Days later, the patient started an intensive 5-week course of chemotherapy. The goal was to shrink the tumor so that it could be more easily removed. He recovered for a month, then had minimally invasive surgery to remove the cancer, along with 24 lymph nodes, followed by 3 more weeks of chemo. The patient had his first solid meal after his initial round of treatment, salmon served on sweet potatoes. He still remembers it clearly nearly 3 years later. As a numbers guy, he knows that even with early diagnosis, his risk of dying over the next few years is a coin toss. It's scary, but he's doing what he can do to stay healthy. He exercises regularly, eats well, despite his worries about the future. He's happy and hopeful. Dog Strollers by Amy Kellner. I admit it, I'm a dog stroller person. I'm also self-aware enough to know how silly it looks. I clock the side eyes when I am pushing my Shih Tzu Darla down the street. I am very aware of the moms with baby strollers who look at me like, "Are you kidding?" And the smirkers who assume that I must be some kind of cartoon villain who spoon feeds her dog filet mignon from a crystal goblet. I don't, to be clear. I am aware of the sentiment in the least charitable corners of the internet that putting a dog in a stroller is a sign of a mental disorder. I try to stay out of those corners. It all started with my neighbor putting a Little Mermaid baby stroller in the recycling area in our building. It was a cheap foldable thing. My husband, Mark, thought it would be funny to plop Darla in it for a cute photo op. As soon as she was deposited, her entire body melted into the seat and she wore a contented expression that we had never seen in the year or so since we adopted her. "Uh-oh," we said to each other. We were still getting to know Darla. We had won her in a contest, sort of. Early in the pandemic, when we were all working from home, my mom called me one morning to insist that I turn on the TV. It was Pet Adoption Week on Live with Kelly and Ryan, and the hosts were hoisting up a confused-looking little black fluff ball. My mom told us that Mark and I should adopt her. "Mom," I said, isn't this a national TV show? I'm sure they get like a million applications. But I filled one out anyway, pretty well apparently. A few days later, Darla was ours. Mark and I quickly discovered that the one weird thing about Darla, all dogs have at least one weird thing, is that she walks really slowly, like turtle slow. There's nothing wrong with her, she's just leisurely. Darla had belonged to backyard breeders and birthed at least 2 litters. When they were done with her, they gave her away. I wanted to let her putter around as she pleased, but this presented some problems. There's a lovely park a few blocks away, but Darla walked so slowly that by the time we got there, it was usually time to turn around and go home. Wouldn't it be great, Mark and I thought, if we could hightail it to the park with plenty of time to romp around? Now, mermaid stroller in hand, the world opened up to us. As we rolled Darla out of the building for the first time, we saw our future. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 18th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. At first we were happy just using the Ariel, as we called the stroller. Then one day I was in Target and I saw someone pushing an actual stroller made for dogs. She was loading items into the stroller next to her contented pup. The multitasking, the efficiency, the ability to not leave a dog home alone and bored all day, I wanted all those things. $75 later, my transformation was complete. I posted a picture on Instagram of Darla's big round eyes peeling out of her shiny new throne. It's happening, I wrote. The stroller's many practical benefits quickly became obvious. I could wheel her all over town while doing errands, and the stroller had enough room to fit her and a bag full of groceries. There was another storage compartment underneath, great for taking packages to the post office. In summertime, we packed the stroller with supplies and picnicked in the park, that our iced coffees clinking like wind chimes along the way, snug in their cup holders. In winter, we didn't have to worry about sidewalks covered with paw-stinging rock salt. The stroller gave me a way to understand what Darla wanted. Whenever she got tired of walking, she did little hops up against the stroller, and I would heave her in it. For every onlooker who scoffs, there's another who gets a real kick out of her. Children are endlessly fascinated. Construction workers are smitten. Old ladies fawn over her. Sometimes friends and neighbors will ask me in hushed tones, should I get one? Yes, I say, go easy on yourself. Life is hard enough. The assumptions that the stroller cynics make, that you can bestow too much affection on pets, that it's overly indulgent and coddling your pets is somehow bad for them, don't make sense to me. It's just functional and compassionate. No one is seriously replacing children with pets, and if they are, so what? And, unlike with children, spoiling your pets won't make them grow up to be jerks. The best thing about the stroller, though, is that it was an invitation to our neighbors to stop and talk with us. Mark delighted in regaling Darla's admirers with the story of her adoption. He would pull out his phone on the street, in the park, in an elevator, to show his unsuspecting victims screenshots of Kelly Ripa holding Darla aloft like the Lion King, while I rolled my eyes, laughing at his shtick and chiming in with my parts. On July 5th, a few years after we adopted Darla, a terrible thing happened. Mark died of complications from lung cancer. It was unexpected, and I was in shock. in the months of my post-trauma haze. The only times I could muster the ability to leave the house was to walk Darla. I wheeled her to the park daily, and we sat by the East River. She likes watching the boats go by. I do two things every single day. I miss Mark, and I walk around the city with my dog in a stroller. People smile at us, and I smile back. I forgive the ones who snicker. You never know what someone's going through. The Ethicist by Kwame Anthony Appiah. I'm in my 60s and maintain a memorial page for my father on a well-known grave locator site. Last week, I discovered that someone linked him to a woman listed as his first wife and to a recently deceased man listed as their son. I assumed that they were errors, but a quick search on a genealogy site confirmed the marriage and the divorce in the early 50s with supporting documents. There was never a word about any of this in my family. I'm left wondering whether my half-brother ever tried to contact my father, why he kept our surname after his mother remarried, and what he was told about his father. I've reached out to his stepsister, whose name I found in his obituary, though I don't know if she'll respond. My immediate issue is whether to take down the memorial page. There are 4 adult grandchildren in our family, and their warm memories of their grandfather would be permanently altered if they discovered about this, if they learned about this. They may discover it someday, but I don't have to make that easier. I also don't know whether my octogenarian mother is aware of any of this. If she isn't, learning about it would devastate her, perhaps as much as learning that I know or that this information is now publicly available. I'm sure it would kill my younger sister if I told her what I found. My wife points out that if our children later discover this on their own, their first question will be whether I knew. Unless I learn more, the honest answer would be that I found out more than 70 years after the fact and know nothing about the circumstances. I'm struggling to understand what responsibilities, if any, I have with respect to what I've learned. I'm sorry that your father kept from his children the fact that he had an earlier family, and if he didn't tell your mother, that was especially wrong. But divorce was more stigmatized and less common in the 50s. In those circumstances, it's not surprising that people sometimes covered it up. Were you to share with family members what you've discovered, you could remind them of how times have changed and how your father's choice to keep the secret, while regrettable, might have felt necessary to him then. It shouldn't feel necessary to you now. We are entitled to know the truth about important facts in our family histories. As I've often said, and taking down the web page would just continue the concealment your father began. Nor in an age of genealogy databases and DNA testing is this information likely to stay buried. I recognize that, as so often, there may be a conflict between two values helping people face reality and avoiding unnecessary pain. But think about your mother, the person most likely to be seriously upset by the news, assuming it's indeed news to her. Surely it would be better that the revelation come from you rather than a stranger online. You could process it together and decide what it means, rather than leaving her to stumble on it later and wonder why you kept her in the dark. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 18th issue of the New York Times Magazine. Your reader has been Evelyn. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the USA Today. Following that at 2 o'clock is Ron Chernow's book, Mark Twain. It's episode number 17. Stay with us. You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. We broadcast daily readings of printed matter to those who are blind or have a print disability throughout Buffalo, Western New York, and Southern Ontario's Niagara Peninsula. Almost 40 years and more than 300,000 hours of radio readings to those without sight. Our broadcast signal is provided at no charge by WNET. Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service broadcast studios are at 1199 Harlem Road in Cheektowaga. Please let others know about your Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. For more information, call us at 716-821-5555.
Hello, this is Chuck Stevens, and this is